Hello and welcome to the 2019 F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is Round 11, the German Grand Prix. The German Grand Prix weekend started in sweltering heat with Ferrari holding the upper hand, but it ended in cold rain with Max Verstappen on the top step of the podium. The season's first proper wet race delivered a thriller replete with tactical errors and strategic genius, excellent driving and some embarrassing crashes. And as a result, this podcast is a little longer than usual, but I'm sure you'll understand that we've got plenty to talk about. And to help me try to dissect what was a very exciting but, let's be honest, very confusing German Grand Prix, I'm joined by ESPN F1 editor Laurence Edmondson. Laurence, how are you doing?
Not bad. I've actually come here because I'm so confused. I'm basically hoping you're going to explain to me what happened over the course of the German Grand Prix.
Well, I'll do my best, but to be honest, it's very difficult. I can't actually remember the last time I sat through a race, got to the end of it, and couldn't figure out how the results happened. But that's what happens with this kind of strange wet weather we had.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great thing, actually. It's really exciting to watch, like thrilling. Anything can happen at any moment. But if you're a journalist and you're trying to write reports at the end of it, you get to about lap 50 of 60 whatever, and you're like, oh God, this is going to be a nightmare. This is going to be horrible. But I guess we kind of got there. Hopefully most of the reports were intact. But anyway, my advice is don't read the reports. Go and watch the race. Find a recording. Go and watch it because it was great entertainment.
It really was. For once, you don't need the summary or the highlights package. Just sit through it and figure out what happened. We had, I think, 4 safety cars, a couple of virtual safety cars thrown in the mix. Almost had only just enough finishes to score points. In fact, we had a couple of penalties after the race so that everyone had a turn in the points, I think, even though not everyone finished there. And really, I mean, even from the beginning of this weekend, before we had the unpredictability of the wet weather, there was not really even a comprehensive or cohesive build-up, considering we went from 42 degrees on Friday to rain and quite cold. I think the best way to sum it up was that there's a shuttle that runs from the car park to the track. On the first day, obviously the aircon was very high. By the time I left on Sunday night, the heater was on. Yeah,
no, I mean, that's right. And it was horribly hot, like really disgustingly hot. 39 degrees, I think they said, but, you know, all the car readouts were coming up with 42 and 43 and all that kind of stuff. And weirdly, Germany is not a place where they really believe in air conditioning. Yes, you get it in the shuttle bus because it's, you know, a car that has to be sold around the world, but pretty much everywhere else, they do it really badly. And Germany does a lot of things really well, but air conditioning just don't do. So those first 2 days, well, Thursday, which is the media day, Friday, which was practice day, were just horrible. Like, I think everyone really just had a bad time. And then Saturday rolled around, and we think we had a thunderstorm overnight, and the heat was just replaced by humidity, again, disgusting humidity. And it was only by Sunday that we all kind of felt like normal human beings, which was fortunate because it was worth paying attention to the race.
Obviously more so than usual, given we got a wet race with only so much dry running, but Friday's practice running, which we normally put at least some faith in on an ordinary weekend and try to dissect the long run pace and predict what's going to happen in the race, was only of extremely limited use given those conditions were not replicated on Saturday or on Sunday. But what we did see, I guess, was that Ferrari seemed quite quick here and Mercedes was a little bit on the back foot, which even they didn't seem to expect.
Yeah, I think it was basically an extreme weather test session, wasn't it? It was like, let's push the cooling to the absolute limit, which is exactly what Mercedes probably wanted. And they came with the rear of the car all opened up. If you kind of look at the back where the exhaust is, there's usually 2 little bits where the bodywork kind of opens up a little bit, and they were significantly bigger. Funnily enough, they actually struggled with it. They kind of got over the problems they had in Austria, which was not being able to run in certain engine modes, stuff like that. They got their head around that. But the car wasn't where they wanted it to be. Meanwhile, Ferrari looked very good, but we were like, well, is this just because Ferrari designed a car for 40-degree heat? And the evidence of the rest of the season suggests it's not that quick when it's cooler. No, funny enough, even on Saturday morning in the final practice session, Ferrari looked quite good and actually had gained a bit of an advantage in the final sector, which is the sector where we all thought they were going to be rubbish. And all of a sudden they were actually faster than Mercedes, having previously been slower than them Friday. So actually, as the weather cooled down, we realised, well, Ferrari have a very, very quick race car that should have been on pole position. I won't jump ahead too far. Should have been on pole position and really probably should have won the race.
The track conditions here in many respects kind of suited the car though, didn't it? Because the first 2 sectors are largely flat out. Then we did have the third sector, as you said, where we expected Mercedes to be the quicker car because it is mostly corners. It's the question I know was asked quite emphatically at the end of the race whether the championship had blown open. I think that's a great exaggeration, but does this show that Ferrari's perhaps starting to turn a little bit of a corner on this car that seemed so peaky only on certain circuits?
Yeah, it does seem that way. I think Mercedes didn't fully understand. You know, if you look at I always think the things to do on Friday practice and in kind of practice sessions in general is look at where the anomalies are. And if you have a real anomaly, and in this case it was Mercedes, they weren't as far ahead as they should be. The Ferrari hadn't really gained a huge amount over Red Bull, hadn't really gained a huge amount over the midfield. It was just that Mercedes had dropped back. So I don't believe it was a turning point. I think it was quite track specific and weather specific on the Friday. But it's certainly going in the right direction for Ferrari, which is good to see. You know, we don't have that same problem that the two drivers had, where they literally can't turn the car in because the front tyres aren't working. And the fact it was quick in that final sector bodes well for, I think, the development direction they started however many races ago, like 3 or 4 races ago. I think it was in France, wasn't it? And that's when they decided this is the way we're going to go, and let's see how the development comes on from there. It seems that direction they took then is actually bearing some fruit, but no, championship, as far as I'm concerned, still over. There's your championship update for this week.
We'll do one every week, and I think you'll find the result is the same. They topped all 3 practice sessions. I think Leclerc got 2 and Vettel got 1. I think it was practice 3. And looking very good for qualifying right up until qualifying started. And then they were looking very bad for qualifying. 2 completely different power unit problems. One eliminated Vettel from the very beginning. Leclerc got to Q3 and then was eliminated. I mean, this was very classic Ferrari.
I mean, and that was a big talking point on Saturday going into the race. It's so funny when you kind of then look at it on Sunday night. But on Saturday, it was just Ferrari of how have they done this? How have they messed this up again? They have so many opportunities, so throughout the year to kind of at least get on level terms with Mercedes at certain tracks, and every time they seem to make a mistake. And 2 reliability issues. It's only an hour qualifying. It's not even a race. It's not even like a 2-hour race. Just within an hour, 2 different reliability issues. And I think Binotto said on Sunday night that they were both first timers as well. So like things that hadn't really cropped up before. So yeah, kind of bad luck, but also just goes to show that the team isn't there in terms of being in a position where it can really challenge Mercedes week in, week out.
Now, strangely enough, there was an interesting parallel that almost completely came to fruition here as we do turn our attention to the race. In some respects, it was even better than last year, which is the parallel I want to draw, where Lewis Hamilton recovered from 14th to win the Grand Prix, albeit with some circumstances. But hey, all wet races have circumstances. Vettel started last because he didn't even set a time in qualifying. Almost won the race himself, which would have been, I would have said, the better recovery. He finished second, though. And I can mention this off the top because while we're going to go through the strategy of this race, his strategy, despite having such a big pull up the order, was actually fairly standard. There's not so much we can pull out as being particularly good, but it did show, because especially when we got that dry running towards the end of the race, as we'll find out, that car was still quick. Throughout the whole weekend, that car was quick and was able to maximise that pace eventually.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You'll remember this first time any of the drivers had driven this year's car in the wet, pretty much. And there's maybe like the odd tiny bit of a session where somebody went out on inters, burnt them up, and then that was it. But like realistically, this was the first time the cars had been driven in anger in the wet. So it was a real venture into the unknown. But yeah, the Ferrari was definitely quick. And, there's an expectation, I think, in Formula One nowadays that if you're one of those top 3 cars and if you're in one of those top 3 cars and you start at the back, you probably should end up in the top 6. And then if you look, well, both Mercedes screwed themselves over, Leclerc put it in the wall, and then, well, Gasly was Gasly. Then, okay, maybe finishing second isn't such a remarkable thing. But still, I think it did go to show, especially that pace at the end, that Ferrari was quick, and that had Vettel not had that qualifying issue, had he started higher up, even in the wet, then, yeah, that was a car that could have won the race, no doubt about it.
Now, before we get into the race itself, important, as you raised, that this was the first real wet session of the entire season. And I suppose more to the point, given the Pirelli's tyres, intermediate and wet, are essentially new this year. There was very little experience on these tyres as well. And you might have seen, for anyone watching the race, several installation or reconnaissance laps at the start, just for drivers to figure out what it was going to be like. Worth noting here as well, and we'll talk about Alex Albon sort of a little bit later on, but first wet Formula One session with no prior knowledge of how the car or the tyres would behave. This was really a step into the unknown, more so than a wet race that is a little bit unpredictable. Yeah,
exactly. And wasn't it wonderful as well? This is the thing that I think somebody put it on Twitter last night, saying that when the teams have no idea what's going on and no data, isn't Formula One a wonderful thing? And it was. But yeah, a huge respect for Albon, because I think I remember in pre-season testing in the dry, he kind of binned it fairly early on in his F1 career, and and that is the reality of jumping an F1 car. It's not a simple business. You're gonna make very silly mistakes in your rookie year occasionally, just because there's a lot going on and there's a lot to understand. So to jump in a race environment and do that well was very impressive, especially early in the race. He was running particularly well.
Mm-hmm. Now, wet races more generally, as we try to dissect the strategy that brought us to the conclusion that we got, is completely different to strategy we expect in a dry race. Dry race is based so much on data, the stuff that people love and hate in equal measure in Formula 1, whereas a wet race like this, and a wet race that then becomes dry and then wet again and then dry towards the end, is almost completely about instinct, combined a little bit with looking at a radar that not everyone believes is accurate and sometimes is not. And it's very much about, I suppose, trust between driver and team, isn't it? That both sides are going to make the right call. We'll get to a couple of examples in a moment, but it's almost not really recognisable for a Formula 1 Grand Prix in that respect.
Yeah, and I think the other factor is luck. There's a massive amount of luck that goes on. But yeah, no, let's be honest, these guys operate on a very high level, but you see a team like Mercedes, and we'll go into this in detail, but how spectacularly wrong it can just go on the basis of a few laps. But there's always those opportunities there, and it's a lot of kind of holding your hand out from the pit wall and kind of gauging the weather, and I think a lot of experience comes into play there. But the one thing I thought was interesting about this race is that one of the best things to do was every opportunity you have, put some new tyres on the car. Like, even if you're going to lose like 10 seconds, put some new tyres on the car. So every time the VSC or a safety car comes up, which was a lot, as we talked about earlier, then you have this instant decision on the pit wall. Where's it going to put us? Do we do it? Is it worth the gamble? And that's fascinating to watch. It's so random, yet there is an element of skill and an element of kind of technical nous there, and also the driver feeling. If the driver isn't happy in the car, then all of a sudden you can lose seconds per lap, and that can be a disaster.
Gambling is also a big part of it. Before we get to sort of the middle part of the race where everything started to unravel, because the first half actually, after the chaos of the first lap, I suppose, was a little bit of a game of waiting. It's worth pointing out, and we'll only probably mention Kevin Magnussen once in this podcast, but he was an example of a midfield team, because it tends to be them, particularly early in these kinds of races, gambling. When everyone came in on around lap 3 to switch off the full wet tyre they started the race on for intermediates, he decided he was going to stay out in the hope, I suppose, because the radar was clearly unclear. Imagine saying that in a podcast. That the rain might intensify and that might be a big win for him. Ultimately, it didn't happen, but these are the kind of decisions that potentially can pay off quite substantially.
Yeah, I think that was a funny one because it was quite early in the race. It was maybe a little bit optimistic that the one decision to stay out on wets would make a difference. But no, I mean, it was like the spiker in 2008 Nürburgring, Winkelhock, I think, coming in and leading the race.
Yes.
And those kind of things do happen, and you do kind of get it. But yeah, unless you're doing that right at the end of the race, it tends to be like a glory moment of the Haas is second, and then quite soon it becomes clear that the Haas needs to change the Inters immediately, otherwise there's going to be no rubber left on those poor wet tyres. So yeah, it works both ways, but. Throughout the race, there were little things like that. And I think if you're in a Haas or something like that, which clearly wasn't very quick, even at the end, they made some pretty good strategy decisions, but still ended up quite a long way back. Then, because Magnussen, right, okay, I'm going to skip ahead. Sorry,
yeah,
Michael,
it's
ruin your run plan.
We have no idea how to really address this.
But we didn't talk about this before. But Magnussen, I think I'm right in saying, actually pitted on the same lap as Kvyat at the end to go to softs, and we saw Kvyat finish on the podium, wonderful. Magnussen kind of followed him up, but then followed him down again because obviously that car wasn't working and he couldn't get the temperature in the tyres. So these kind of decisions can get you on the podium in a midfield car, but if it's not all quite working, they can also bite you. But the thing is, because there's a safety car at some point, even if you drop like 60 seconds back off, you're probably going to get back, as long as you don't lose a lap too much, then you're probably going to get back up and have another go at it anyway.
Inversely, Magnussen's very late stop at the start shows what tends to more often than not be true in wet races, in that it's those who gamble early on early changes tend to be the ones that pay off, whether we talk about preempting rain or preempting a track being dry enough to switch to slicks. And that's what this first half of the race really was about. It was about, at first, trying to make the inters last until it was either very much dry enough for slicks or the rain came back. And we saw, as you said, pitting behind virtual safety cars or safety cars was the only way drivers are really stopping here. Leclerc and Hülkenberg in particular. And this is where the race started to unfold, took the opportunity behind a virtual safety car triggered by Daniel Ricciardo, stopped Renault, ironically enough for Hülkenberg, to switch to new intermediate tyres. And that essentially was a free stop and gave them that extra bit of flexibility. Because there's so much waiting in a wet race, isn't it, to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, and tyre management, I mean, we talked about it in the dry, but it's essential on intermediate tyres on a dry track because you get that dry line. And the rubber on the inters is really soft. You know, I think it's softer than the soft. You know, it's really soft because it's designed to retain heat in wet conditions and continue to offer grip and bite into the surface through the rainwater and stuff like that. So all of a sudden, when you're running it on a dry line, it just flies off and melts and disappears. So even in those conditions, going off, cooling your tyres on the wet, you know, you see that a lot on the straights. Drivers will move way off the racing line, trying to find a damp patch to cool the tyres. That's essential to keep them going. Or you do the other thing, which is, you know, you take the gamble and you move to slicks. Funny enough, talking about Magnussen, let's talk about him again, because he was the first one to go to slicks. He was the first one to do it. Yes. And it didn't really work out. I think he all of a sudden started setting personal best middle sectors. So obviously they were close to the crossover, but his times in sectors 1 and 3 were so far off that you know it wasn't going to make a difference. But he triggered it. You know, he was the one that first went. And again, like you say, if you can be that first one, sometimes it can make a massive difference and get you a number of positions at once.
Ironically enough, in this middle window where the track had been drying for a while, the rain had sort of abated. This is where the race went wrong for those, or not for everyone who switched to slicks, but for some of those who switched to slicks, because in reality, there were sectors of the track that were not dry enough. It didn't dry in a uniform way, maybe because it was still raining in certain parts of the track. And then the rain did ultimately come back. I want to start with Charles Leclerc first. We've already started to mention him. Was in quite a good position at this point. He did start 10th, but made pretty good progress up the order from there. Got a free stop for those new intermediates behind the virtual safety car, as we said. And then jumped, because of this, Valtteri Bottas up to second, and Max Verstappen as well, who was in third at the time, demoted to fourth. Potentially was looking good for a win here, because he had fresher tyres than Lewis Hamilton. The pit stops and the order of all that kind of things were eventually going to give him an opportunity to move up. And then the race started going very wrong for him. I don't think he used his catchphrase, "I am stupid," but he did sort of look a little bit like that as he beached himself in the gravel.
I think it was, no! No! To which a lot of German media in the press room went, yes! And we all erupted into laughter at a very serious point for Ferrari. But what incredible, huh? Ferrari finally, strategy starts going well, you know, and this star driver that they've let down again and again and again through the season is the one who messes up. He's the one that puts it in the wall. And it's funny because earlier in the race, I seem to remember him holding this ridiculous sideways slide across the little lump that distinguishes the track and that horribly greasy kind of drag strip. And he did this crazy slide, like, you know, like almost like grinding down this sausage curve and all this kind of thing. I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive. But funny to see that, you know, beyond that was complete disaster, and we saw it again and again during the race. And and he complained that the runoff was too stiff for him. Well, no, forget it. You know, that's if you're off the track, you know, that's a problem. And it's a funny one, isn't it? Because I wonder how many drivers were warned of how perilous that corner could be if you went over the limit. But anyway, for him it was. But go back to the strategy side of it. That was down to the risk of going on to slicks while it was still fairly damp. And while he went on to softs and struggled, Verstappen and Bottas, the nutters, were on mediums. Like
this surprised everybody, and I'm not sure what your reading was at the time, but I assumed that at this point the radar must be showing, and we'd sort of been told early in the race the rain was for 30 to 60 minutes. And so we were more than 30 minutes into the race at this point that perhaps the rain was gone, and this was an incredibly bold attempt from Red Bull and Mercedes, who followed, to try and make it to the end of the Grand Prix without making another tyre stop. Very ambitious in retrospect, obviously.
Yeah, it is, and it also shows you probably that Red Bull, now we look back at it, well, Verstappen won, and it almost seemed quite straightforward towards the end, but at that point they were taking huge risks. Like, you know, they obviously didn't think they were going to win it, because they had, you know, the Mercedes ahead of them on track, and they had Leclerc on this like great strategy kind of coming through. So clearly they were looking to try something a bit different. I don't know what they were. I mean, it's around that time, we were talking about it earlier, where Verstappen came on the radio and said, "What's the radar saying?" And then Red Bull replied, "We can't trust it," which maybe explains why they did go for mediums, because they just like, this radar's nonsense. It's telling us it's going to start raining again in 5 minutes. No, let's completely ignore that and go on mediums to the end of the race. So yeah, I don't know. It was a very strange decision, but of course, to go into the details of why that's an issue, the warm-up on those tyres is even harder than it is on the softs. It takes even longer to get them into the working range. And as soon as the tyres aren't in the working range, we hear drivers talk about it all the time when the conditions are fine and how much time you can lose. Just go to any Haas press session and they'll bore you for a good 20 minutes on the complexities of the tyres. Add a little bit of water in and it's a complete disaster. So, crazy. And of course, Verstappen spun. He went through 360 degrees. 2 corners before death corner, as I think we're now calling it, or maybe not death corner, kind of crash out the race corner. So just 2 corners before that, he spun 360 degrees, and had that been anywhere else on the track, had he not had, obviously, a huge amount of car control that he does have, I always like seeing Verstappen do a 360 spin, because chances are he's going to end up pointing the right way at the end of it, and just carry on and be like, I've kind of meant it. So he did that and carried on. But yeah, that was so close to, and a realisation that even the best wet weather drivers in those conditions can potentially throw it all away.
With such a bold strategy as well, potentially could have undone his race. And this was because not only the tyre warm-up, but suddenly the rain was returning. And you talk about that interesting tension between, Max asking what the radar says and the team inversely saying, don't forget the radar, tell me what you think. There's got to be trust in that connection. And that really came to bear on Lewis Hamilton, because just as Charles Leclerc, I suppose, was having his crash that started to change the complexion of the race, Lewis Hamilton was feeling as though the rain was going to come back. He was still on Inters at this point, but Mercedes decided, given the Inters were also quite old, to bring him in on slicks, because virtually everybody else was on slicks at this point in time. He said he lamented afterwards that he didn't speak up at this point, because this is what really completely undid his race, moving to slicks. Yeah,
I mean, you got to remember there were periods of the race before that he was leading by 7 seconds, and it's like that meme I've seen on Twitter recently of the safety car, and it just comes and it's going to destroy your lead and eat your leader. Anyway, so he had been looking pretty good out there. And then, he was out on Inters, still lapping reasonably quickly. Tyres weren't in awful shape. And it was at the end of the VSC, I think, for Norris.
Yes.
I think I'm right in saying that. It was certainly the end of VSC. And Hamilton came into the pits. So he missed out on the VSC kind of element of getting a kind of slightly cheaper in-time pit stop. And came in and put on the slicks. And, proved to be a bit of a disaster, because that was just as the rain was coming. But I feel like it's almost like a Mercedes thing where they try and be a little bit too clever. It's like, there's VSC, we've got to make use of it. And rather than being like instant, they kind of like do a little bit too much background work, and then by the time they made the decision, it was too late. And then, of course, further. Was it on his out lap that he then?
I think because he switched only one lap later. If we have a look at our lap chart, it was fairly quickly afterwards, because the rain essentially started arriving on his out lap. The conditions began deteriorating. And this was the first in, I suppose, a line of mistakes that Mercedes would make in this Grand Prix, because whether, as you say, this was born of the fact that they overthought the strategy at this point in the race where a decision really had to be made, or whether this was just the conditions deteriorating around them. Subsequently, this sort of pushed, I guess, the lag time for every decision further and further. The mistakes compounded on themselves. And, of course, the worst of them, I suppose, that really set them off was that Hamilton crashed on the next lap, and this is where things really started to go wrong. Yeah,
exactly. So, Hamilton puts it in the wall, and he does it. To be fair, he got it out as well. I mean, not every driver managed to do that. Most drivers went in there, didn't get it back out, but he got it out of that little gravel trap. But by that point, he was beyond the bollard where you're meant to go to the right to enter the pits, which means he got a 5-second penalty later on, which then kind of influenced some decisions a little bit later on, which we can talk about then. But and then obviously he came in, and there was this pit stop where they weren't expecting a car to come into the pits. They had some tyres out by the time he arrived. He also needed a new front wing. But you can imagine that situation. I don't think it was immediately on TV. So they probably heard a roar from the crowd. They were like, oh, something's happened. And then next thing they know, Lewis is on the radio saying, I've been in the wall. And then next thing they know, the car's coming down the pit lane. And that's the first they say, oh, God, half the front wing's gone. And obviously we're going to change the tyres. So there'll be a kind of modus operandi, which they have to go to, which will be, well, in that case, bring the tyres out that he's on, bring them up because he's on those tyres for a reason. This isn't a planned stop. Just put some fresh ones on because that will help him. So I think in the pit lane they had some soft tyres ready to go on. The nose was a little bit slower coming, but then there was I think what's become on social media the Benny Hill moment, where all of a sudden the mechanics start running around and one guy in kind of 1950s garb like nearly slips over and then nearly headbutts another guy, and then somebody picks up a tyre and it's the wrong one and it's probably one of Bottas's, and then and they all kind of run around in circles for a little bit. And I think I'm right in saying it was about 50 seconds.
50.2 I think was the stationary time.
50.2 seconds.
Which is not quick.
It's not quick at all. And of course they had to change the front wing. So there was an element of like all the faffing around with tyres wasn't actually, the crucial thing, because it took them a while to get the wing off. Getting a damaged wing off is always difficult. And then eventually they got the Inters into the pit lane. And better to make that decision. Yeah. Imagine if they'd sent him back out after all that, sent him back out again on soft tyres, and he'd gone and had another accident. So at least they got that bit right. And in reality, he only dropped to 5th, I think.
Because we're under Charles Leclerc's safety car conditions at this point. Not as costly as perhaps it looked. Yeah, exactly. So definitely the point that the race unravelled for them, but it didn't put it beyond their reach, I think. But I guess the 5-second penalty was a big thing as well later in the race. And anyway, so and then he goes back out on Inters, and it was a tricky race from that point onwards. But then then all of a sudden this is when you're like, oh well, actually Verstappen all of a sudden becomes a clear favourite because all that messing around in the pit lane also meant that any hope of getting Bottas in and kind of putting him back onto Inters, because he had gone onto the mediums as well, but being a Finnish rally driver dealt with it and didn't he was just enjoying drifting around. I mean, I remember watching him coming into the pits to put back the Inters back on after the whole Hamilton debacle in the pit lane, and he kind of just came like sideways through it, and he just looked so comfortable. I was like, this guy honestly is wonderful. I then changed my opinion later in the race, but at that point I thought, wow, what a hero. So he was just there rally driving around on medium tyres, but couldn't come in because the pit lane was blocked, and I think the team had other things on their mind. Yeah, so that delayed his pit stop until the following lap to go into Inters, which in turn affected his position. That was the first set of really substantial mistakes, but as you said, this is where Max Verstappen started to look like he could be in control of this race. The race eventually resumed with intermediate running. And then we got to this strange part where, again, the rain began to abate a little bit, and we had this decision, much as we did in the first part of the race, as to whether do you go for a new set of intermediate tyres, and we did get a safety car period that allowed for another change, or when do you start thinking about slicks? Now, Verstappen at this point, we talked about Red Bull Racing making quite substantial gambles with that medium tyre. Then I suppose maybe it's because you're in the lead of the race, you start to actually think a little bit more sensibly. And on lap 41, we had another safety car. I think it was actually triggered on lap 39, but in any case,
the start of lap
it
was
40.
Hülkenberg, wasn't it?
Yes.
Hülkenberg in the barrier from quite a good position, but a promising position.
Perhaps we should detour here briefly.
Okay, let's do it.
Because he was, of course, we know he holds the record for most race starts without a podium. Yes. Found himself in second after all the chaos of this safety car with Lewis Hamilton and Max Valtteri Bottas's poor stops. Of course, the car didn't really have the pace to be there, but he had some pace to fight. Dropped positions fairly quickly, and then the race really ended for him.
Yeah, and if you looking at his strategy, he was on like, this is how he was on the perfect strategy basically up to that point, because he got that pit stop in on lap 15, which meant he was on new Inters midway through the first kind of phase of intermediates.
And that was a VSC stop as well.
That was a VSC stop, so nice kind of cheap pit stop for him there. And then he never went on slicks. So at no point in the race was Hülkenberg on slick tyres, which up to that point was absolutely the way to do it. He pitted on lap 29 for a new set of intermediates, which was basically by the time everybody else had realised that the slicks were the wrong way, and he just made up a lot of positions. But he'd been running, I think, as high as 5th at the start. So clearly he was in. We've seen he's very good in low grip conditions in the past. He's got things in his locker, such as his Brazil 2010 lap,
Yeah.
pole lap,
which we refer to often.
Yeah, I mean,
too often.
it's basically, why does Hulkenberg still deserve to be in F1? Well, in 2010, he once put it on par. Anyway, so he was there in a very strong position on the right tyres at the time, and he fell foul of that penultimate corner as well, and the ice skate rink that they've kind of now opened by the drag strip, and so and then put it in the barrier. But yeah, that opened up an opportunity, and Red Bull nailed it, because to pit Verstappen there, free pit stop, and he's on inters, and he was already the quickest man out there, and now he looks even quicker. That was really kind of Red Bull operating at their best and kind of, seizing every opportunity. And as I said before, like, if in doubt and you've got the gap, stick some new tyres on it, because it's only going to help you later on.
So with that in mind, a mistake then, would you say, that Mercedes didn't follow there, because it was sort of not even damned if you don't. Verstappen's gone in for new inters. Now, that's going to hinder you at the restart, I suppose, if you've got older intermediate tyres. Why not just come in and change? And whether or not you move immediately to slicks, as most drivers did, it didn't make a difference.
So I think if they'd done it with Bottas, he would have moved behind Hamilton, which obviously championship fight, or and even if you are on new inters, what's better, old inters or similar age inters ahead of Lewis Hamilton, or new inters behind Lewis Hamilton? I mean, I'd rather be ahead and try and defend, especially because you don't know which way the race is going to go. You don't really want to see track position to Lewis Hamilton. Pretty much anybody else in a wet race, fine, not Lewis Hamilton. So I think that's why they didn't pit Bottas. And then Lewis, I felt they should have. They should have brought him in. He was running behind Bottas. Their thinking was that 5-second penalty that we talked about earlier for going the wrong side of the bollard. They said that would have dropped him behind Albon. Now, just as I was talking about one man not to be stuck behind, Lewis Hamilton, one man who you probably wouldn't mind too much, first race in wet conditions against probably one of the best wet drivers in the world, Lewis Hamilton. Yeah, I think they should have pitted him to put him on a fresh set of inters at that point, and sent him back out and seen what Lewis could do. So I'm not really sure. I think that was, again, one of those things where it's like they were almost looking at a safety car and thinking, oh, can we get a free pit stop? And it's like, no, it's not quite going to be a free pit stop. It's like, all right, in that case, we don't pit. It's like, well, no, you can't think about it. The reality of it, then actually that might have been good. But the other thing about all these split-second decisions is it all depends where the car is on track and where the safety car's picked up whoever, or at what point it will pick up whoever. And if you get that wrong, you can also kind of mess it up. So it's not always quite as straightforward as it looks to give Mercedes the benefit of the doubt. But with that one, I felt like Hamilton should have pitted, got rid of that 5-second penalty. Because remember, if all of a sudden they'd gone to the end of the race on the same set of inters and there'd been a safety car at the end and they'd all been bunched up as they crossed the line, Lewis would have lost 5 seconds. He could have lost like 5 positions or something like that. So I felt it was almost better to get that 5-second penalty off his off his shoulders, basically, and bring him in. But they didn't. So.
Yeah, well, as you say, adding it up at the end of the race is almost essentially what happened, because rather than pit behind the safety car when the field is running at reduced speed, they made the pit stop when the field entirely pretty much decided to switch to slicks under racing conditions. At the time you were still running, I guess you could argue in contention for at least the podium. This completely eliminated him. It dropped him out of the points, and he never really recovered until there were penalties after the race. Yeah,
that's exactly true, yeah. I should have said that a second ago, but yeah, no, exactly. So it's just further proof that I think, odd decision not to go under inters, and then, it's almost like they were a little bit resigned to defeat by that stage, Lewis, and poor Hamilton as well. I think, I know it's not strategy related necessarily, but he was feeling awful in the car. I don't know exactly what the problem is or whatever, but Wolf said afterwards, I think a lot of people wouldn't have got in that racing car and gone out. And I remember seeing him on the grid beforehand, stood by his car on pole position, and he'd done a few laps to the grid, and he already looked a bit sweaty and kind of shaky. And he wasn't right, and arguably maybe shouldn't have been in that race. So I think by that point they were like, "Oh, Lewis, do you want to maybe just call it a day," which he almost did by sticking the barriers at turn 1. But I don't know. I guess that was just everything kind of, everything going wrong that could go wrong after that silly pit stop.
Yep, and the final point, we'll jump ahead briefly for Mercedes' race, was that Bottas, running in contention for the podium, just binned it in the end, and that really ruined Mercedes' day completely.
Yeah, it's ruined Valtteri's year. I'm not kidding. That was, of all the opportunities, how often do you go up against Lewis Hamilton and he's making mistakes, and he's clearly not where he should be, and the team's made mistakes for him as well. And how often do you get an opportunity to take, even if you're just taking it easy and cruise behind Stroll, potentially 12 points, but obviously he was pushing for that second place. But how often do you get an opportunity to do that? And he should have got 18 points yesterday, and he stuck it in the barriers. And it was a funny old accident, because he said afterwards that the team had just told him to push. Would have thought that was probably obvious at that stage of the race, and push to a limit as well, because you've only got to get past a racing point and a Toro Rosso, and those cars in drying conditions should be beatable for a Mercedes. And I watched the replay from overhead, and he just got as he kind of went through the apex, he took a little bit of curb, car kind of moved a little bit to the left, just onto the wet patch, and before he knew it, he was round and into the barriers. For all I said about his rallying prowess, if you look at how Hamilton kind of spun out of a similar incident at turn 1, kind of let the car immediately go into 360, Bottas was fighting it around, and before he knew it, bang, in the barriers. So I don't know, I think there's something to be said for drivers kind of like figuring out what's going on midway through a slide, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, maybe they just all kind of soil themselves and let go of everything. But sometimes you see a driver come out of a spin, you think that should have been the barriers, which was Hamilton at turn 1, and sometimes you see them kind of go into the barriers, and that was Bottas. So I don't know, maybe I'm kind of putting too much into Hamilton's kind of genius there, but no, it was a shame, and it's a real shame for the championship, because wouldn't that have been great if another upside of this brilliant race was that the championship actually looked a little bit more on again, kind of going into summer break, but it doesn't.
No,
it looks the opposite.
Instead, Hamilton ended up scoring 2 points by the end of this race.
Exactly.
Incredible, isn't it? But we almost skip over, I guess, the final particularly interesting part of this race, which was behind that last safety car. There were 2 stops that perhaps seemed innocuous at the time. The first was of Lance Stroll, who very briefly ended up leading the race. But he stopped not once but twice behind the safety car, first for new inters, as was sort of the done thing at that point, but then requested of the team to change to slicks, deciding that it was worth a gamble. He was pretty much at the back of the field at this point. And this proved the inspired call of the race. I almost wish he'd won, just so he could say, wow, the race deciding move. A very bold but ultimately accurate call. Yeah,
very good decision. And you know what, I think we kind of are quite critical of Lance Stroll quite a lot, and I think sometimes with good reason. But in these kind of conditions, he's actually pretty good. I think his base car control and kind of feel for what's going on isn't bad. His feel for how a set of soft tyres will deteriorate over a 30-lap stint is dreadful. But his base car control, and I think if he really applied himself, he could be quite a good racing driver. But anyway, I digress. He made that stop, Racing Point made that stop. He came in and dropped right to the back of the runners, to the back. But, of course, what was it? Within the space of 2 laps, are we talking? Basically 2 or 3 laps. Everybody else had made the same decision. And in that time, I think he had set... I don't know if it was the outright fastest lap, but he was certainly lapping quickly. And I think it was immediate from the sector times after the safety car that actually he was looking pretty good. And and then that triggered all those pit stops, including Kvyat, who also ended up in a very good position the lap after.
Yeah, so quite astute monitoring of the race by Toro Rosso as well, because they decided to bring Daniel Kvyat in. He was also running fairly towards the back, let's say. Consistently was behind Albon this weekend, despite Albon having no experience. But this rocketed him from essentially 5 or 6 positions behind Albon to the end of the race, finishing more or less that far ahead of him. And it showed that was exactly, we talk about trying to pick that correct window for the tyre change. This was exactly the right window in the correct conditions as well behind the safety car. And we had this situation with Stroll leading from Kvyat very briefly in this race. Unfortunately, the Racing Point sunk down the field more quickly than the Toro Rosso did, but the end result was that Kvyat finished on the podium, first time in 3 years. Yeah,
fully deserved, and got past Stroll on track, I think I'm right in saying as well. So, there was a lot going on there, because it's not as simple as just bolting on the right tyres at the right point. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we look at Kevin Magnussen down on our lap chart, and he also went to softs on lap 45. Our little chart here tells us they were U-softs, but I really don't think that's going to be, the be-all and end-all at that stage of the race in those conditions. So Kvyat able to maintain the temperature in them, get them to work, and go on to take a glorious podium. Magnussen, dropped like a stone, even though he made up a lot of positions. early on by having the same strategy and being one of the first ones to change. So I think that says a lot about Fiat, how far he's come, how well he's driving. It's a real shame about F1 at the moment, isn't it? Because midfield drivers, you can't really get a gauge on them until you get a race like this, and then they really shine, or sometimes they really mess up, like Gasly, for example. He's not really a midfield driver, but he shouldn't be. Yeah, and so like when you see someone like Fiat do that, you think, wow, this guy's still got something there, and it's fantastic with the whole backstory of his partner giving birth the night before, and of course everything else that's gone on for Gasly in the last kind of 2 years, 3 years, so lovely to see him on the podium again, and fully deserved based on a very, very solid strategy at the end.
Yeah, a very interesting strategy. It's worth mentioning at this point, we only mentioned it at the start as well, that Sebastian Vettel really came alive on those softs, as the Ferrari had in practice. Perhaps missed one opportunity, which was to pit a little bit earlier. He didn't stop until lap 47, which was after Verstappen. Potentially had the opportunity to gain a couple of places for that final charge. Whether it would have made the difference to make a dream last to first run is debatable, but that car was very quick.
Yeah, it was, and yeah, like we said earlier, he wasn't really on a great strategy. It was a fairly kind of middle of the road, react to what's going on strategy around, and I think they took a couple of punts, didn't they, just because of his position. They got that that interstop, but it wasn't free for him. So that interstop under Hülkenberg that we talked about earlier, when Verstappen made it and got a free set of intermediate tyres to go and disappear even further into the distance. Vettel took a hit for that. He actually went down the order with that. So it wasn't a fantastic strategy. But then at the end, on the soft tyres, it was an example of a driver with experience. I think definitely something to prove after what happened in very similar conditions last year, getting it right. But he was good to watch throughout the race, because even early in the race, that car was twitching around, and there's a couple of times when, obviously, it was only 2 weeks ago that he went into the back of Max when he was trying to make a passing move. You think, well, maybe Seb's lost it, and he's never been. I would never put him as one of the really great kind of wheel-to-wheel drivers. I always think there's a little bit of weakness there, but he looked good. He looked very good, and was saving some spectacular slides and all the rest of it. So he did it in style, and fair play to him. But I still think Ferrari's takeaway from this weekend is that they should have won the race, regardless of the conditions. And they finished second, so they won a podium, but they lost the race. A fair conclusion, I think, and a fitting conclusion for the podcast. I hope we've done a fair enough job of trying to summarise what was an absolutely chaotic race with an unpredictable outcome. Who'd have thought we'd be sitting here 3 races in a row celebrating Formula One? What is this, MotoGP? It's all very confusing, but it's been a pleasure to look back on it with you, Laurence. Yeah, thanks very much.
That was ESPN F1 editor Laurence Edmondson. The strategy report is powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. Play it for free on iOS and Android devices. If you want more strategy report, you can get every episode by subscribing on Google and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on your favourite podcasting app, plus all of your socials. And if you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you could give us a review and a rating to help other F1 fans find the show. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast, and if you're looking for an alternative take on the German Grand Prix, have a search for Box of Neutrals in your podcasting app of choice to hear Rob James and I ask whether sprinklers on racetracks aren't such a bad idea after all. I've been Michael Lamonato. Look me up at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in just a week's time for a look back at the Hungarian Grand Prix.